The answer is blowing in the wind. Father, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be made acceptable in thy sight. God, you are our strength and our Redeemer. Let your word go forth, never to come back void, but accomplish the purpose for which it is sent. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. Would you stand with me all over the building and turn with me to the book of Galatians, the 6th chapter and the 9th verse. The book of Galatians, the 6th chapter, in the singular verse, the 9th verse. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. As you take your seat, take someone by the hand and say to them, friend, do not give up. Amen. My subject is continuing on. Continuing on. There's an old saying that if I heard it once, I heard it a million times, that a good deed is its own reward, and that may in fact be the case. I will not debate that maxim. But I will say this, a good deed may in fact be its own reward, but a good deed does not in fact recharge and renew the battery of the do-gooder. Because there's a simple statement here being made by the Apostle Paul to the saints in the hill country of Galatia, and that is, nothing wears you down and can wear you out like the commitment to do good. It may be the fact that those who make cameo appearances on the side of right, and those who come along when it's the popular thing to do, and those who sashay in and out of the presence of God and at their own will and whim and inconsistency, and consistently pick up the banner and run with it for a while till their amusement runs out. It may not wear them down, but for those who are committed in the long run, in the marathon, that conviction conscripts you into the fight. As the old folks used to say, I'm on the battlefield for my Lord, and I promised him that I would serve him till I die. When we have that till I die mentality about fighting for right, nothing can wear you down and wear you out like fighting for right. And so Paul just has a simple message. Don't get weary in well-doing, for in due season you shall reap if you don't give up. And here in the book of Galatians, Paul is fundamentally talking to a church whose message of the free grace of God was under assault by folks that biblical writers call Judaizers. That were those Christians who were at first members of the Jewish community and Jewish faith who had converted to Christianity but wanted to drag along with them all of the Jewish regulations, basically the Torah. They wanted to say, in order to be a Christian, you have to first be a good Jew. So they wanted the church to impose upon both Christians from a Jewish background or a Gentile background, and Gentile is simply shorthand for anybody who's not Jew, impose upon them the Jewish feast calendar and the Jewish kosher laws and the Jewish regulations. And basically, non-Jewish people were pushing back, saying, we don't want Jewishness, we want Jesus. And the simple fact that they were no longer under the law of Moses, but they were under Christ. And so Paul in his wordplay talks about, as he pushes back on the imposition of the law of Moses, he says we should adhere to the law of Christ. And the law of Christ is simply paraphrased in shorthand for the two things that are prefaced by Jesus saying, do this and you fulfilled all the law and the prophet. It is one, the great commandment. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God, thy heart, thy mind, thy soul, thy strength. And the second commandment is like unto this, that thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And then the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. They're the same statement. It is a paraphrase of saying that anyone who has any authenticity, legitimacy, viability in affirmations or proclamations of vertical relationship with God, that the meat on the bones, the proof of it, the litmus test, is does it show up in how you treat other? how you treat your neighbor. Because if you truly love God, how can you say you love God whom you've never seen and be so unresponsive to the needs of your neighbor who you see every day? But that is the proof of it. And so toward that end, Paul, after splitting these theological hairs, these nuances and delineations between law and grace, he moves into the 6th chapter to have an explicit conversation about what is our responsibility to each other, those of us who are under the banner of Christ. He starts the chapter at life's most common denominator for all of us, particularly when we start talking spiritually, when he says that if your brother, and you can plop in sister, if your brother or sister be overtaken in a fault, ye who are spiritual, restore such a one, considering yourself, lest you also be overtaken in a fault, in sin. And so he starts in what is most common to all of us, that is sin. We're all sinners. We've accepted Christ, so we're saved sinners, but we are still to the bone sinners. Look at the person to your right. That's a sinner. Look at the person to your left. That's a sure enough sinner. Look at the people in the row behind you. Now shout out and say, all y'all sinners. Now take your neighbor by the hand and say, neighbor, you are looking at a sinner to the bone. Yes. Yes. We ain't all black. We ain't all white. We ain't all straight. We ain't all gay. We ain't all educated. We ain't all uneducated. We ain't all Democrat. We ain't all Republican. But we are all sinners. So when he starts talking about our obligations for one another, his reference point is let's be real. And let's admit up front what we all are, because our response to neighbor needs to be rooted in an acknowledgement and an admission of we all are. Because he says, listen, we all deal with sin. And he says, if your brother or sister be overtaken in a fault, and the verb he uses there that gets translated as overtaken, is translated off a Greek cluster of words. The verb function in the Greek language that means hunted down and overtaken. He uses a verb that is hunters used in reference to predatory creatures like wolves, who eat because they're able to run down and then rip apart their slower, more defenseless prey. He deliberately uses this vicious verb to talk about the dynamic of sin in the life of people who are even saved, because he's talking to the brothers and the sisters, those within the church, baptized, saved, sanctified, loved, allowed, L-A-W-D, because he heard your cry, pitied every grown church every week, singing in the choir. And yet sin is still so real that the proclivity for it, that sometimes the impulses of sin that course through all of us move with such speed and such power that even when we have a mind to do right, we can be overtaken by our internal impulses. Like a wolf can run down a sheep before the sheep has a chance to even collect itself and even start to run. Now, think about that. He's saying that even when we have the consciousness to do right, each one of us in our own unique way have sinful impulses that can take us over to the point where we can do the evil that we would not, because the impulses got going before our conscious could kick in to say, no, I shouldn't do that. Now, he didn't have the benefit of modern clinical language to say addiction, because anybody in addiction rehab understands that there are things in your life that you can be powerless against, that it is stronger than your will to resist. He can't use the language obsessive compulsive. He can't talk about impulse control, lapse of it. He didn't have that clinical insight. He just knew in looking at people that even the most religious of people, the most spiritually sincere people, if you watch them long enough and catch them on the right day, God is the last person you'll think they know. So when we start talking about our obligation to other frail people, he also understood that as sinful as we are, one of the greatest manifestations of our sinfulness, ironies of our sinfulness, is we have the nerve to be judgmental about other people's sinfulness. Jesus put it this way: why are you so concerned about the needle in your neighbor's eye and so comfortable and quiet about the beam in your own eye? We will point a finger at a neighbor when there's three pointing right back at us. Paul addresses all this because most of what Paul does is a paraphrase of what he heard Jesus speak. He says, if your brother or sister has been run down by their monsters that rage from within them, and you're around to see that, ye who are spiritual, really saying ye who are looking at this spiritually, not judgmentally, not self-righteously, not giving in to your own impulse to say tisk, 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 when you got so much more worse going on in your own life. You just ain't been found out yet. He says, but ye who are looking at it spiritually, starting from an admission that you too are a sinner. He says, restore such a one, considering yourself. So when I see you in your contradiction, your weakness, your frailty, I start my thinking about how to respond to you by considering my own self, being honest about how likely, probably, I too could be in just as bad or worse a situation. And how would I want you to respond to me? Would I want you to post me up on Facebook? Would I want you to call me out? Or would I want you to come alongside me and help me pull myself back together? Maybe speak a word in my ear, word to the wise, to pull my coattail before the train wrecks or after the train wrecks, to step into the train wreckage and help me pull out and get back to those greener pastures. Realizing that but for the grace of God, there go I. We owe that kind of empathetic response to one another, given the fact that we all are sinners. Look at that person next to you. They still a sinner. But as the conversation evolves, he says, and he moves on to say, bear ye one another's burdens and sorrows, and so fulfill the law of Christ, because we're not under the law of Moses. We're not trying to impose the Torah on the church. Y'all stop running over to Leviticus and all that kind of stuff, because we're not trying to be good Jews. We're not under the laws. Therefore, information. But we're not under the law. Stop using that. Stop weaponizing Old Testament material to go after people groups that you're uncomfortable with. So sick of hypocritical Christians who aren't admitting their own sinfulness, losing parts of the Bible to weaponize it against people groups that you're uncomfortable with. Huh? And he says, bear one another's burdens and sorrows, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Now, we're not under a Christian legalism. That is Paul's paraphrase for what he already says. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Love thy neighbor as thyself. That's the law of Christ. In that you fulfill all the law and the prophets. So if that is to bear one another's burdens and sorrows, then why do you turn right around the next verse and say that each man should bear his own burden? Which is it? It's actually a word play, because it's and in both. Because what we see in English is translated as bear ye one another's burdens and sorrow. Every man should bear his own burden. There are two different Greek words that are unfortunately both translated as burden in English. It was customary, let's keep the text in the context, make sure we ain't functioning from a pretext. In that part of the country, where the roadsides were commonly made of soft limestone, the debris of rocks that had fallen from the hillsides, some big boulders, some small. When one walked the roadsides, and I've been in places like Jordan and others to see it for myself, you're constantly stepping around stones that have made their way from the hillsides onto the roads. And so when it says, bear ye one another's burdens, there's a Greek word that is translated as burden that means little stones. Stones that reasonably you can either step over or move to the side. There's some objects you can pick up and carry and do it on your own. There are some troubles in life, burdens, that it is reasonably to expect you to handle themselves, and you really should not ask others to do what you can reasonably be expected to do for yourself. You got the ticket, you pay for it. You taking her out, you pay for the meal. Don't ask me for money so that you can pay for the date. You taking her out, if I got to pay for it, I need to date her. pay for your own aspirations. It's reasonable. There are things to reasonably expect someone to be able to do. But by the same token, it's also not so uncommon for there to be landslides and so forth where big boulders come in and block the road. And if people are to pass, they need to get help to move a boulder that is beyond the strength of any one person, or maybe even two persons, and a group of people must move. We see that reality when the women went to the tomb on resurrection morning and they asked the question, who shall roll away the stone? Because a band of women did not have the physical strength to move the stone that was put in the door of the sepulcher, the grave, to seal the tomb of Jesus. They needed some man strength, and more than one man. A group of women needed the strength of a group of men. Who shall roll away the stone? There are people in Houston, victims of Harvey. There are people in Florida along the Gulf Coast, the victim of Irma. There are people in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, the victims of Jose. It is not reasonable for us to expect them on their own to rebuild their devastated communities. When the mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico says in response to the Homeland Security person, one of the several incompetent people as a part of this presidential administration, who says that what's going on in Puerto Rico is a good luck story, and she says, clue in, ma'am, news flash, we're dying here. We have no fresh water here. There are people with diabetes who haven't had their metformin and they're dying. People on dialysis who can't get to the hospital. There are elderly people who haven't had water or food for a week. There are corpses all over here we haven't even counted yet because we can't get to them. We're dying here. You had 40,000 people on the ground in preparation for Irma, and a week after Jose, you only have 5,000 troops in Puerto Rico. That is 20 times the size of the ground you were protecting in Florida. It is not reasonable to expect that little island nation, which is a U.S. territory of which every person born there is as much American as you or I, to pick themselves up by themselves. Why is it a collective effort for some people, and other people, their lives seem not to matter? Bear one another's burdens and sorrows. That is the law of Christ. How can you say you love God that you've never seen and be so unresponsive to these people who are facing a burden that it is unreasonable to expect the local tax base to be able to rebuild Houston? It's unreasonable to expect certain parts of Florida they could rebuild their communities and infrastructure and roads and bridges and cell phone towers. It's unreasonable to think those people could feed themselves and clear their roads and add and rebuild their dams of their own. It's going to take the massive effort of the many. And the question becomes, what kind of nation are we? Even what type of faith community are we? What are we preaching from our pulpits regarding this matter? So we not only have an obligation to come alongside one another when we are all at risk of our internal implosions to the monsters of the deep inside of us, that even when we would do good, we have the proclivity to fall to sin in a variety of ways. For some people, it's anger. You're like an Incredible Hulk waiting to happen, a Bruce Banner. All you need is a little agitation and you swell up in a hurry. For some people, you know, it's that casino. You know, you rationalizing it, talking about they have good food there. That's not the only place you can get something to eat. For somebody else, it's that liquor bottle or those drugs or something. You find it hard just to say no, even though you know how it has wrecked your life. For somebody else, it's when somebody of the opposite sex walks by and something in you goes, that those monsters come in different forms, but all of us have something in us at any given time. As saved as we are, it could implode on us, and we have an obligation to come alongside one another and help each other make our way, avoid those train wrecks or step into those wrecks and return us to green pastures and still waters. We have an obligation. While all of us should bear our own burden, we have an obligation to bear those burdens that are far too big for any of us to bear on our own. And so in a world where storms can sweep up and destroy communities, in a world where we got opiate addictions that now is called a public health crisis, because when it was crack, it was a crime problem. In a world, no, that's just the HV system, yes. But if you believe that that's the Lord saying amen, amen. If that's what it took to get your attention, amen, lights. In a world filled with geopolitical strifes and unstable leaders in other countries dealing with going back and forth with our unstable leader, and all of them armed with weapons that could destroy the world many times over, he says, in that world, not only must we bear one another's burdens and sorrows, he says, don't go weary in well-doing. There's so much to be done. And if you're like me, where you're halfway committed to trying to make a difference in a world full of need, where you got infinite need and finite resources, sometimes you can get tired of doing the right thing. You hear the goodwill fatigue in the poem where it says, go break to the poor sweet charity's bread. For giving is living, the angel said. What? Give again? I said with dismay. Must I keep on giving and giving away? Oh no, said the angel, piercing me through. Just keep on giving till the Father stops giving to you. But somehow or another, we must, in spite of the gauntlet of demands, you're asking for your tithes and offering, and you're asking us to sign up for compassion, help people around the world, and then I go to Fred Meyer and buy the stuff, and before I swipe my card, it says, do you want to round up by $2 to give to the Hurricane Harvey Fund or the Urban Fund, and then go get some gas, and they say, you want to round up for this and round up, everybody trying to round up, and you're saying yes, and sometimes you get tired of nothing can drain your battery like doing good. Biblical writers even believe that because we're sinful in nature, doing good actually exacts us, takes more out of us than doing evil. Because evil seems to be more in line with our nature, so it takes more out of you. Doing good is like straining into a headwind, one writer said, and so it is easier, it is less exhausting to do evil than it is to do good. That's why Paul said we press toward the mark of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. We have to put more effort into doing good. It is actually easier to do bad. Huh? If you cuss me, it's easier for me to just cuss you back than it is for me to hold my peace and walk away, even though the desire to cuss you back, or worse, is coursing through me. To hold my peace and walk away, I actually feel exhausted because the energy it took not to slap the black off you exhausts me. You got a crazy boss and you got to decide every day not to snap because you got bills to pay. It's exhausting. It would be so much easier to just let her have it. Nothing wears you out like doing good. And Paul says to those of you who are committed to doing good, not every now and then, not when it's on the front page, but as a lifestyle, because you're connected to him and he has some expectations for how you interact with them. He's saying, do not grow weary in well-doing, for in due season you shall reap if you don't get tired, run out of gas, get tired of doing good. So to be able to not run out of gas, I'm going to say this, get out your way, you got to believe in what you're doing. You got to believe in what you're doing. You got to persist in what you're doing. You got to be willing to sacrifice and even suffer for what you're doing, and you got to be willing to wait. You got to believe in what you're doing. You got to persist in what you're doing. You got to be willing to sacrifice, even suffer for what you're doing. And you got to be willing to wait. And to make his point in his day, Paul used an gruel analogy that everybody there understood, because most of them were peasant farmers eking out, scratching out a living from a stingy earth. They understood the realities of how the seasons change in relationship to planting and harvesting. They planted in the springtime, they harvested in the fall time. If you wanted to harvest something in the fall time, you had to be diligent in the springtime. But if you planted in the springtime, there was not going to be any immediate harvest in the springtime. You planted in hopes of harvest in the fall time. And so you planted. Everyone who planted with a harvest in mind. Those who do good, we're doing good, like planting seeds. Our actions are like seeds. We're planting because there's a harvest in mind. Huh? When Colin Kaepernick took a knee, there was a harvest in mind. When the Freedom Riders got on those buses, there was a harvest in mind. When Susan B. Anthony and others marched, there was a harvest in mind. When Malala Yousafzai in Pakistan, a 15-year-old, began to fight for women's education in Pakistan, there was a harvest in mind. There's a harvest in it. So you plant, and you plant seeds. You even allow your life to be a seed, if it may, in light of a harvest in mind. Without a vision, people perish. You have to be aiming for something. What are you aiming for? He who aims for nothing hits it. That's the problem with most of us who say, I just want to get back to football. You ain't aiming for nothing. People are aiming for something, oftentimes get derided by people who ain't aiming for nothing. And people who are aiming for something can't get discouraged by the ignorance of people who ain't aiming for nothing. You have to believe in what you're doing, because the reality is doing right is never the normative behavior. Right is the consciousness of the minority. As sinful as our foreparents were, and I'm talking about the founding fathers, those misogynist, racist, slaveholders, and sometimes God can make a straight strike, make a straight strike with a crooked stick. That's why there's hope for him using you and I. And he certainly did it with the founding fathers. But they did have an ideal. When they put that Constitution together, they enshrined within it the right to protest for right. And they did it because they knew if you're going to have a democracy, while the majority may govern in terms of the outcomes of elections, unless you're voting for the president, and then you can actually lose the vote and still win the election. It's hard to convince me that my vote counts if the person who loses by 3 million votes can actually win, the loser can win. Time for the Electoral College to go. It's the most undemocratic thing you can do. And given that it was an accommodation to slave owners in the beginning, since slavery's gone, all the accommodations to slavery should go with it. Losers should lose and winners should win. But while the democracy, the majority wins in terms of elections, that same Constitution protects the minority from the tyranny of the majority. And in a democracy, because you don't want an autocracy like they had in Europe, they enshrine the freedom of press to hold power accountable, because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So to hold those other branches of government and economic institutions accountable, you have the free press so that the people who have the right to know can know what they need to know, so they can act responsibly in terms of their right to vote and engage their society. So you have to have a free press, and you have to have freedom of assembly, and you have to have freedom of speech, so that people then have the right to speak truth to power. That is essential for a free democratic society. And so the framers of our Constitution realize that there's times when the majority is wrong, and evil becomes enshrined in law, or becomes de facto or de jure the normative way of life, and the conscientious minority has to be empowered with the right to speak their right. That is the constitutional provision. And newsflash here, my brother, you cannot use the flag as an instrument to discourage people from the exercise of constitutional rights. Newsflash, there is not a single serviceman or woman, not the Navy, Army, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, National Guard, who's ever shed a drop of blood for the flag. Check your oath of service, your induction oath. You pledge to protect the Constitution of the United States from all enemies, foreign and domestic. Not the flag. It's not in your oath of induction. And if you thought you were defending the flag, you signed up under false premises. The president and every governor, mayor, congressperson, even down to local jury pools you've voted, you took an oath of office to protect the Constitution, which guarantees our right to free speech without reprisal, and to freedom of assembly and freedom of press, along with freedom of religion and all the other rights. In other words, it protects our right not to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. It protects the right to burn the flag. You cannot use the flag, which is a symbol of the Constitution, against the exercise of the rights protected in the Constitution. You are literally choosing symbolism over substance. And when you're using the symbols of the rights as a tool to discourage the exercise of the rights, that's not patriotism, that's fascism. How many times have you seen in the name of religion people use Christian piety as an excuse to not exercise Christian love? How many times in the name of Christian righteousness or whatever have we've justified hating groups when the call is to love? And politically speaking, we would use the flag to discourage this false appeal to patriotism, to discourage people from exercising rights that people bled to protect my right to express myself in ways that you can't stand. See, we really don't believe in freedom in this country. No, we don't. Freedom is not your right to do what you want. Freedom is my right to do what you think I'm going to hell for. And as long as it does not physically threaten you, you have no right to try and stop me from doing what I'm free to do. Freedom is when I protect my neighbor's right to do what I think is crazy. That's when I'm committed to freedom. Freedom is not my right to insist that you have to behave like me. If I could talk to NFL players today, I would say to them, I hope you all stay on your knee this whole season and invite your players, your coaches, and the fans to join you on your knee in an acknowledgement that there is a problem with how African American people are treated by law enforcement. There is discrimination in law enforcement, which is what their protest was all about. It had nothing to do with the flag, had nothing to do with patriotism. They protested during the national anthem, not the national anthem. And their protest, not one national anthem was disrupted, canceled, or otherwise interrupted. The national anthem went on uninterrupted. Let's debunk a few myths here, people. You're disrespecting the flag. Not one color guard was stopped from unfolding the flag. They took a knee. Colin Kaepernick took a knee at the insistence of a Marine officer who said, why don't you take a knee? Because that's a universal symbol of respect. So he modified his protest, which was initially sitting quietly on the bench, on the knee, because a universal symbol of respect. And they sang the national anthem uninterrupted. Not one time during all this has the national anthem gone uninterrupted. Not once. Not once. Then for people say, well, you're disrespecting people who fought for the flag. Nobody fought for the flag. You fought to protect the Constitution. The flag does not guarantee one right. It's a symbol. It means nothing. It's just a symbol. Huh? And then the fact people say, I've heard people say, well, I just want to get back to football. I just want to get back to football. Unless I'm wrong, not a single game was canceled, delayed, or interrupted. We've had just as much football as we would have had if you wouldn't have had black players on the sideline protesting the fact that black males have a 10 times more likely chance of getting shot by the police than any other demographic. And since they are black males, if not them, then who? Calling attention to something that affects them. Well, then somebody says, well, I just don't want to deal with all this. I just want to deal with football and watch football. Oh, really? I just don't like the NFL using its platform for things unrelated to football. Oh, really? In October, you're going to see this month, the whole league is going to go pink for breast cancer awareness. They're going to wear pink shoes, pink socks, pink towels. The officials will wear pink hats, even if it collides with the color scheme of their uniforms, to be an awareness for breast cancer, even though none of the players or coaches have any breasts. Not one player on one team is at risk of breast cancer. But every team for an entire month is going to go pink to use the football, the platform of the NFL to bring awareness to breast cancer, even though nobody on the team is at risk of breast cancer because they don't have breasts. So you're going to tell me that you'll use the platform of the NFL to promote breast cancer, which is okay, I agree with that. It seems to me, if you want to be fair, that the WNBA ought to have a month devoted to prostate cancer, but that's a whole other sermon. But if these breastless NFL players are all going to wear pink so that you can watch the NBA, so that you can bring awareness to breast cancer, even though none of those players are at risk of breast cancer, then you're going to tell me that a football league that's 71% black, that they can't use the platform of the NFL to call attention to something that 71% of your players are at risk for, which is to get killed by the police? Don't tell me you have a problem using the NFL as a platform for non-related issues when everything's going pink. You have to believe in what you're doing, because when you stand as the conscientious minority, it's a given that the majority of the people don't agree with you. If they did, you would not need to protest. If you would have taken an opinion poll in December 1st, 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, and asked the average person in Alabama, did they agree with Rosa Parks sitting down on that bus seat? It would have come back overwhelmingly that that was disrespectful. We need law and order. See, some people want a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, Martin King said, versus a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. And when she sat down on that seat, this is where Paul was talking about, you shall reap if you faint not. You have to believe in what you're doing and believe in a harvest. When she sat down on that bus seat December 1st, 1955, it was not the first time. Thousands of black people had been drug off those buses. Why did it spark then? Because on August the 28th, 1955, 3 months and 3 days earlier, 12-year-old Emmett Till was drugged from his house, his cousin's house, in the early mornings, because supposedly he had whistled at a white woman. These are the days when a white woman cries, a black man dies. And he was taken by a group of Christian men out and thrown into the Tallahatchie River with a 75-pound weight around his neck after they had disemboweled him, castrated him, stuck his cut off genitals in his mouth, pulled out his eye, cracked his skull in 3 places, disemboweled him, and then threw him in the river, and his body washed up along some lonely riverbank. They did that in the name of protecting white society. His mother, Mamie, decided to have an open casket funeral to show the world the real violence that was beneath the surface in the genteel white Christian South. All this stuff they want to call legacy, heritage. No, it is hell for people of color. And she had an open casket funeral that not only showed the violence of the South, the white Christian South, but also the vulnerabilities of democracy, because the 2 men that were arrested for the murder were acquitted by an all-white jury. And then when they tried to press civil rights charges, those charges did not stick, because racism permeated the system, not only to the degree that a mob would take a child and do that to him, and a jury would turn around and acquit the killer, but that the government entities would not even see it as a priority. How different does that sound from today? They accused Mamie of being vulgar in showing that atrocity before the nation. But protest by its nature is offensive and disruption. We call ourselves Bible-believing Christian people. When the children of Israel got away from the covenants of God, what did Jeremiah do? He protested. Politely? No, sir. He took a vase and took it to the temple and threw it to the ground, and he said, this is what God's going to do to you. He's going to shatter you like pieces if y'all don't get it together. They didn't listen. He wore a girdle around him with rotten vegetables. He said, you guys are rotting, because they were not living up to the ideals of covenant. They didn't listen. So he took off all his clothes and he walked around buck naked. He said, this is the way you are. You're not clothed in righteousness. You're naked before God. Obscene, unrighteous. Protests offend. They're intended to shock you and jar you. They hurt you before they can help you. They cut you before they can cleanse you. They wound you before they can make you over. They offend you before they give you insight. There's no polite way to protest. And the framers of our Constitution knew that you have to give people the right to say that's going to offend the many, because sometimes the many is wrong and their wrong ways are enshrined in law and normative in society. And the conscious minority must be empowered with the right to say the thing that's going to make everybody mad. Most of our heroes today were villains in their day. Martin King, a national holiday, and his name today, but they blew his brains out in his day. 3 months before he was killed, the Buffalo Baptist Black Ministers Conference voted not to receive him because he was an outside agitated. Ignorant black preachers, no different from the 8 white clergymen in Birmingham who said he's an outside agitator. He pressed on. He did not grow weary in well-doing, even though many of his own people misunderstood what he was doing. When Rosa Parks sat down on her seat in 1955, December 1, she said she had Emmett Till on her mind. What happened to Emmett Till caused her to rise up, and when she sat down, the whole 50,000 black people walked together. And by the way, do you recall what day the March on Washington was? It wasn't an accident that they put it on August the 28th, 1963, the anniversary of the death of Emmett Till. Because his life was like a seed that was planted for a harvest. It caused people to stand up. 15-year-old Malawi Yousafzai in Pakistan. She's got a Nobel Peace Prize now as an international symbol of women's empowerment now. But when she first stood up, it was unpopular in the country and they blew half her head off. She's popular now. Cheney Goodwin. They're iconic symbols now. And Schwerner are symbols now. But there are 2 white boys, a Jew, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and a black guy were disemboweled, castrated, and lynched by white Christian people because they dared to try to sign black people up to vote. Their names are iconic now, but their deeds were considered illegal and unpopular. It's a given that the things we say are going to offend people. James Baker, a legendary chief of staff in Reagan's White House and Bush's White House, thought the players should have demonstrated a different sort of way. But I want to ask Jim Baker, if you think black men kneeling quietly without disrupting the national anthem offends the flag, even though it's walking in the protected rights of the Constitution, tell me why you've never raised your voice when Ole Miss and over 100 other colleges and universities, their football teams take the field carrying the Confederate flag. And you've never raised your voice against the monuments built unto the rebel leaders that fought against the flag. Why does a black man kneeling quietly in front of the flag offend you more than somebody flying a rebel flag in his place? Women should not care if the majority of men are upset when you stand against their misogyny, you stand against their sexism. LGBT can't get upset when the majority of heterosexual people want you to go back in the closet and don't want to honor your relationships like theirs. It's a given that people will be against. You are the minority opinion. So you have to believe in what you're doing. But check this, the 2 videos you just saw, the white lieutenant colonel who was telling people, if you can't treat people different from you, respectfully get out. He referenced in his speech the events of Charlottesville and Ferguson and what's going on in the NFL. Why? Because they have persisted. A white lieutenant colonel is now telling people in the armed forces, get the hell out if you can't act right, because black players have convicted him. Colin Kaepernick is not looking for his job back. He had a job when he took a knee. The goal is not to get him his job back. The goal is to make sure that black people are equally protected by the law, the same as everybody else. Don't let somebody else co-opt your movement and redefine your narrative. He was willing to lose his job, and every other black player in the league should be willing to lose their job. Martin was willing to lose his life. Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman was willing to lose her life. Fannie Crosby and them were willing to lose their life. Malawi was willing to get her brains shot off. Must Jesus bear the cross alone and all the world go free? What are we willing to do? What are women willing to do to advance the cause of women? What are gay and lesbian people willing to do today? If you lose a job, so be it. God will provide for you. If you use your life, so be it. God will give you life on the other side. The world can knock you down, but God will pick you up. You don't need their permission. You don't need opinion polls. Of course they're against you. The first step to changing them is to convict them. And conviction's first expression is an outcry. In 2000, when we shut down the freeway because Robert Thomas Sr. was killed by an off-duty police officer, we had to take down our website in Mount Zion because of all the ugly comments we got from people and all the threats. Harry Bailey and Ron Sims came over my house, talked about a protection plan for me because I was defined as the leader of it. And my impudent self, I just told them, just tell them folk, I'm not completely devoted to nonviolence. They better not show up here. I'm not Martin. Now, that probably wasn't the smartest response. But the fact that people were more concerned with the fact that they almost peed on themselves in traffic than they were the fact that people who look like me get their brains blown out and you never even have to broach that conversation with your child. I'll keep marching. Those players need to stay on their knees to those white teammates who don't get it, because they don't have to have that conversation. And if they don't get it and get mad, so bad. And if the owners want to fire them, so what? Let them try to market an all-white NFL and see how the ratings go. I am honoring everyone who ever was in service, more importantly, everyone who ever died, everyone who was ever lynched, everyone who ever sung a sorrow song. I'm honoring them when I stand in the rights that they bled and died for. Not a flag, a principle. I have the right to say to a bigot, fascist, misogynist president, shut the hell up. I don't have to scratch when I don't have an itch. I don't have to look at the ground when I didn't drop nothing. I don't have to chuckle when ain't nothing funny. I don't have to shuffle my feet. You can fire me. God has already shown me no matter what you do to me, he can do more for me. So every now and then, free people ought to act like it. Harder yet may be the fight. Wrong may often yield to might. Right may often yield to might. Wickedness a while may reign. Satan's cause may seem to gain. But there is a God that rules above with a powerful arm and a heart of love. And if I'm right, he'll fight our battles. And we will be free someday. And Jesus would not come down from the cross to save himself, because he didn't come to save himself. He came to save you and me, and he's willing to be a seed that will be buried, because there was a harvest he was pushing for. And that harvest was that in spite of our sinfulness, we could be reconciled unto God, and therefore he would not come down from the cross to save himself. And I say to you, if you're fighting that fight, bear your cross, because the grace of God, it will keep you, it will feed you, it will recharge your battery, it will heal you from the wounds, it will pick you up every time they turn you down. If you do not quit, turn to your neighbor and say to them, neighbor, I know you're a sinner, but don't quit. Now come on, give God some praise.